The morning that followed was as fine as any September could produce, the air cool enough to sharpen the senses while a pale gold light lay upon the lawns. Greystone had always looked its best under a sky such as this, and perhaps that was why the first uneasy pause of the day passed as unheeded as the rustle of a leaf. At 7:30, Jennings entered the breakfast room to draw up the blinds and set out the silver urn. He was a man who performed his duties with the careful neatness of a ritual, and it may be imagined how little he liked to find things irregular. Yet irregular they were. The French windows that gave upon the terrace were unbolted from within, and the latch, which habit dictated must remain hooked through the night, hung free. He frowned, shut them fast, and took stock. Nothing else seemed amiss. The urn hissed. The sideboard of cold meats gleamed. There was the faint scent of evening smoke, as if someone had stood there late and opened the door to the night. By 7:45, Mrs. Ray sent up the light breakfast trays to the ladies who preferred to eat in their rooms. Lady Margaret never did. She believed firmly in the civilizing influence of a communal table, even at an hour when words were an imposition. She came in precisely on the hour, a little stiff about the shoulders, nodding to Jennings, who placed the Times at her right hand and the grapefruit at her left. She disliked surprises before coffee. It may be guessed, therefore, what she felt to see Charles Harrington arrive at 8:05, rather flushed, his hair not quite so sleekly pressed as usual. He offered an apology which said everything and nothing. "I woke later than intended," he announced, selecting rashers with a cheerfulness that no one mistook for tranquility. Clara followed him a minute later, pale, composed, her eyes ringed as though sleep had eluded her. Beatrice Latham came with her shorthand pad tucked under her arm. Habit again, she jotted figures for Lady Margaret's correspondence whenever a letter occurred to her mistress between marmalade and the third cup of tea. Dr. Forbes appeared at 7:15, claiming an early call had detained him. He did not elaborate. He never did when patients were the subject, though it had been murmured more than once that his definition of a patient could be elastic. Colonel Redmayne came last and thumped his stick in apology, barking that cold mornings had no understanding of an old wound. It was Evelyn who did not come at all. "I suppose Miss Grant has elected to breakfast upstairs," Lady Margaret said, cool as winter. "Clara, perhaps ring and see." Clara did so. The maid who went up returned with the information that Miss Grant's bed had been slept in, but the room was empty, the windows open upon the balcony that overlooked the south lawn. The maid had thought nothing of it. Miss Grant was a restless young lady and had a fondness for air. "Very well," Lady Margaret replied. "No doubt she is walking. She will be cold before the coffee is done." The line of her mouth suggested a certain impatience with youth's energetic habits. They ate, or made a pretense of it. Conversation wandered to the harvest fair in the village. The colonel lamented the decline of proper horsemanship. Charles remarked too lightly upon a filly he had once fancied. Beatrice, glancing toward the terrace doors, noticed something at the margin of the flagstones, a timid scatter of sand upon the stone where none had been the evening before. The gardeners sometimes spread grit against frost, but not in September. She said nothing. Her habit was to observe first and decide later. It was Jennings who proposed that the French windows had been unbolted that morning because they had been left unbolted last night. "I found them so at 7:30, my lady," he reported, but nothing appeared disturbed. Lady Margaret Spoon paused against porcelain. "There is no question of intruders," she said, "not as inquiry but as law. See that the maids take greater care." By 9 o'clock the house had loosened into the small freedoms of the morning. The colonel took the newspaper to the library. Charles vanished to the smoking room under pretext of a letter. Clara walked, not toward the south lawn where she might have encountered youth and scandal alike, but into the rose garden, where she stood quite still among the thorns for several minutes as though counting them. Beatrice carried a bundle of correspondence to the study, arranged the blotter, and then, having no immediate dictation, took her hat and notebook and went out. Dr. Forbes declared himself bound for the village. He had a patient near the mill. No one saw him leave by the front, and the back drive was empty. It is unwise to suppose that a doctor's movements belong to the public. They do not. At 9:20, Beatrice turned the corner of the south terrace. The day possessed that curious quiet one hears sometimes in September, a pause before a wind begins. The old oak rose out of the far end of the lawn, no nearer than it had been yesterday, and yet it seemed to Beatrice that it had advanced a step or two in the night. She smiled at her fancy. A rook stirred in the branches. The light on the bark had a gray, silken sheen. She saw the shoe first. It lay just beyond the ring of flattened grass that circled the trunk, a small, frivolous slipper with a satin bow. Pink. She recognized it as Evelyn's, for there are some things that belong unmistakably to the very young. A few feet farther on, something metallic winked, a bracelet with a broken clasp. The oak's bark bore, at the height of a man's head, a fresh abrasion, pale wood peeping through the old. At the foot of the trunk, there was the sort of scuffed hollow one notices at gates where many feet have trodden. She stepped forward, and with that the quiet of the day broke like glass. Evelyn lay in the grass with her head toward the tree and her arm flung out, as if she had reached for the root and failed. Her scarf, the laughing scrap of silk that had danced on yesterday's breeze, was knotted about her throat. Her face was the color of wax flowers in a cathedral and quite as still. Her eyes were neither open nor shut. They had been closed by a careful hand. Beatrice stood perfectly still. She was not a woman who screamed. Then she turned, not running, and walked back toward the house. Jennings met her at the terrace steps. He had known something was wrong when he saw the way Miss Latham walked, measured, entirely contained, as though she carried a brimful vessel and must not spill a drop. He did not ask a question. He followed. There is a kind of haste that has dignity. Together, they brought Lady Margaret, and together, without any public display, they sent for Dr. Forbes. Charles appeared at once. He had a knack for appearing at once, and Clara soon after, white as salt. The colonel was slower. He had mislaid his stick. They went down over the lawn in a figure oddly formal, like a procession of mourners who have not yet learned the name of the dead. Dr. Forbes kneeled, the breath in his throat a short, troubled sound. He touched Evelyn's wrist, the lobe of her ear, the side of her neck apart from the scarf's knot. He looked at the ground with the focus of a man who has more to see than may be seen. "She has been dead, I think, less than an hour," he said at last, glancing without comment toward the closed face. "Strangulation by the scarf. There are faint marks suggesting it was pulled tight from behind and then knotted. No other injuries that I can see, though there is a bruise on the left forearm as though seized. The grass shows signs of a brief struggle." "An accident?" Charles asked at once, too quickly. "Surely, a freak mishap?" Dr. Forbes shook his head. "It would be a strange accident that contrived a sailor's knot." Then, Clara's voice failed her. Lady Margaret spoke instead. "You will ring the constabulary, Jennings," she said, "and have the gardener set a rope to keep people back. No one is to come near. No one at all." In the pause that followed, a rook called once, twice, as if to mark the hour. From the tower clock at the stables there came then the slow striking of the half-hour, 10:30. It was curious how solemn those 7 strokes sounded, falling as they did upon a scene already complete in its solemnity. The police in such villages are decent men with practical notions. Inspector Barnes, who arrived at 11, was a thick-bodied, careful person who disliked grand gestures and disliked, still more, the interference of county families. He set about his work as he had set about his porridge that morning, methodically, without relish, and intending to finish it. The body was examined, the scarf not photographed, measurements taken from trunk to shoe, from shoe to bracelet, from bracelet to scuff mark. A constable noted a narrow smear of something pale on the bark below the abrasion, sap, perhaps, or chalk. The inspector lifted it with a moistened paper. He found also a strand of hair caught at the broken clasp of the bracelet, fair, as might be expected, and, narrowing his eyes, he stooped to a small dark fleck at the edge of the flattened circle of grass. Cigar ash, perhaps. Colonel Redmayne did not smoke cigars. Charles did, and so did Barnes himself. He had the grace to feel put out by the coincidence and ordered the fleck carefully collected. Later, near the first fork of a root, a faint crescent pressed in the damp earth resolved itself into the impression of a heel with a distinctive crosshatch. One of the constables ventured that it looked American. The inspector said he did not care for opinions about nationality in leather and told him to fetch a board to preserve the print. Alibis began, as they will, before anyone called them by that name. Clara, questioned quietly by Barnes while Lady Margaret stood apart like a statue carved from a harder stone than the rest of the world, said she had gone into the rose garden at 9:05 and remained there until 10, walking and sitting by turns. No one had seen her. She did not add that she had stood, at one point, so long beside a thorned arch that her hand bore a neat, bloodless prick. Beatrice stated that she had left the study at 9 and walked to the south lawn by 20 past. She had found the body almost at once. Charles declared he had been in the smoking room from 20 minutes to 9 until 20 past 10, writing a letter he did not post, and confessed, when pressed, that he had smoked a cigar to steady his nerves. Jennings reported that he had seen Mr. Harrington cross the hall at 9:15, cigar indeed between his fingers, to fetch something from the library. "A blotter, sir," Charles supplied, which he neglected to return. The colonel said he had been in the library with the Times until the striking of the half-hour from the stable clock. He had then gone to look for his stick, which he had left in the morning room, and lost his way among side tables. Dr. Forbes had left, he said, by the back drive at 9 sharp, intending to visit Mrs. Chalmers at the mill. He admitted he had not gone straight there, but had cut through the lower meadow to avoid a newly mended gate. He could not remember exactly when he had turned back. Mrs. Chalmers, when fetched, affirmed with village precision that the doctor had knocked at her door at 10 minutes to 10. He had left at 10 past. The miller had seen him go, head bent, watch in hand. There were smaller things, all of them with the irritating readiness of littleness to evade the net. Beatrice noticed that Evelyn's scarf, the silken thing now cruelly repurposed, had carried, yesterday, a faint scent of violets, and that today it was masked by something sharper, a bitter almond, so faint one might dismiss it as a trick of imagination. The inspector, who had a practical nose, detected only damp and grass. On the terrace, near the French doors, there was the sand Beatrice had seen, a narrow sprinkle, as though a shoe scraped on a gritty path and shook itself free upon the stone. In the breakfast room, a cup with a smear of lipstick, a pink very near to the color of Evelyn's shoe bow, stood alone on a side table. Clara did not wear lipstick. Lady Margaret frowned when the inspector pointed it out and said Miss Grant had the careless habit of leaving her belongings and her presence about the house with indiscriminate grace. Jennings added, very softly, that the cup had not been there when he laid the table at 8. Maps of the grounds were produced from the drawer in the study. Greystone South Lawn ran almost 200 feet from terrace to oak. To the left, a ha-ha divided grass from pasture. To the right, a gravelled path curved to the rose garden. Beyond the oak, a fringe of trees dipped toward a stream. Anyone leaving by the French windows could cross the lawn in sight of the house. Anyone wishing not to be seen could skirt the rose garden hedge and come round the back of the tree. Sightlines, Barnes noted, were generous from the upper windows and poor from the library bay, whose view was interrupted by a clump of late hydrangeas. It was possible, then, for one in the library to be unaware of movements beyond the middle of the lawn. The colonel, questioned again, was certain he had not looked up from the Times between 5 past 9 and the half-hour. He had been engaged upon a leader he described as pompous. When the body was at last carried in, wrapped and borne with respect, Lady Margaret stood very straight and did not cry. It was Beatrice who noticed her hand close so tightly upon the back of a chair that the knuckles whitened. "You will wish to inform Mr. Whitcomb," the inspector said, as gently as his nature allowed. "Your son." Lady Margaret replied that her son lived in Paris and would be telegraphed. He was not at liberty to travel quickly. She asked, further, in a voice that did not tremble, that the police would show care with the house. It had been her home all her life. There was, at noon, an odd little flurry about the telephone in the study. Jennings answered, as was proper, and, after a moment's hesitation, said very distinctly that Miss Grant could not come to the telephone. No, she could not, and that Lady Margaret would return the call later. He replaced the receiver with a composure so perfect that only Beatrice, who had come to fetch the second sheaf of letters, saw the slight tremor in his hand. That, she thought, was loyalty. It was also a fact. By 12:30, Inspector Barnes had the beginnings of his pattern, and because he was honest, he admitted that it resembled tangled wool more than woven cloth. Evelyn Grant had died between roughly 9 and 10, upon a lawn overlooked by the house and approached by any one of 3 paths. There were signs of struggle, slight, a scarf to tie and to kill, a broken bracelet clasp, a faint smear on bark, a heel print with a crosshatch, a fleck that might be cigar ash. There were alibis with minutes that rubbed against each other like ill-cut stones. There was motive. What country house is free of it? But motive had not yet presented its face. He told the constable to keep everyone in sight and took himself to the breakfast room, where the air still held the scent of coffee and the undisturbed cup with the pink smear. He was not a fanciful man. And yet, standing there and looking out through the French windows at the expanse of lawn and the far, patient oak, he had the oddest impression that the house itself was listening, all its windows for ears, all its corridors for nerves. In such houses, truth does not stay unspoken long. It rises, like sap, quietly, invisibly, and bursts out where the bark is thinnest. When the card was brought in at 1:45, Jennings bore it on his tray with an expression that, for him, amounted to astonishment. The card was small, creamy, and perfectly engraved. The name upon it, faintly foreign, had the calm of a bell heard at a great distance: Hercule Poirot. The arrival of Hercule Poirot at Greystone Manor was one of those small events which, in later recollection, seemed charged with inevitability. Fate, that capricious arranger of lives, had decided that the Belgian detective, neat, precise, and celebrated, should be within 10 miles of Hertfordshire at the very moment when a knot of human passion tightened into violence. He had been staying at a modest inn on the river, taking what he described to Hastings in a recent letter as a little holiday for the digestion and the nerves. The countryside, he declared, was admirable for repose. He liked the trimmed hedges, the symmetry of the orchards, and the reliable punctuality of the railway. And then came the newspaper item, a small column describing a fete at Greystone Manor in aid of the village school. The name of Lady Margaret Whitcomb caught his eye, for he had once made her acquaintance at a dinner in London. She had then impressed him by her poise and the delicate economy of her words. Out of courtesy, he had written to announce his presence in the neighborhood. The invitation to take tea with her had been delayed by circumstances. Now, quite by chance, he came to call at an hour when the house stood on the threshold of scandal. Inspector Barnes, who had just established his headquarters in the morning room, received the card with suspicion. He was not a man enamored of consulting celebrated foreigners. Yet Lady Margaret, upon seeing the name, insisted. Her tone brooked no refusal. Jennings brought the little man in. Poirot's appearance at such moments was always disconcerting to those who had not met him before. He was of middle height, fastidiously dressed, his mustaches curled to perfection, his patent leather shoes gleaming though the lawn outside lay damp with dew. His head was slightly inclined, his eyes bright and inquisitive. He moved, not like a man entering an alien household, but like a guest stepping into a familiar drawing room. "Madam," he said, bowing with elaborate grace, "I grieve to intrude upon so somber a house. It is with sorrow that I have learned." His eyes flicked, quick as a bird's, to the oak visible through the French windows. "An evil thing has come here." Lady Margaret inclined her head. "Monsieur Poirot, your timing is singular. My goddaughter, Miss Evelyn Grant, has been killed. The police are with us." Poirot bowed again, and when Inspector Barnes made his stiff introduction, he listened with perfect politeness. "You will understand, Monsieur Poirot," the inspector said, "that this is a police matter." "But certainly, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," replied Poirot, spreading his hands. "It is your case, your authority. I intrude only as a friend of Madame Whitcomb." Yet, his eyes lingered on the broken clasp of the bracelet, laid carefully upon a tray nearby. "Yet when crime is present, it is my instinct to observe." Lady Margaret's thin lips softened by the merest fraction. "If Monsieur Poirot is willing to observe, I should be obliged. I have faith in the constabulary, but faith too in, how shall I put it? The understanding of character." Barnes muttered, but allowed it. Poirot moved delicately about the morning room, his eyes noting every detail, the chairs hastily rearranged, the cup upon the side table with the lipstick smear, the faint mark on the carpet where a chair had been dragged back too quickly. He bent, inspected, straightened, all with the air of a man attending to trivialities which, to him, were not trivial at all. "I will ask, madam," he said, turning to Lady Margaret, "that the household is gathered together. It is the custom of the police, yes? But it is also my method. To see them, to hear their voices in one room, it tells the little things which escape in solitude." Lady Margaret gave the order. Within minutes, the circle reassembled, tense and watchful. Charles Harrington stood with his hands thrust into his pockets, trying for an air of nonchalance that was not entirely successful. Clara, pale but composed, kept her gaze lowered, as though she feared her eyes might betray her. Beatrice Latham sat upright, notebook on her knee, her pencil moving as though even in grief she must record. Colonel Redmayne leaned heavily on his stick, his mustache bristling with indignation. Dr. Forbes stood at the back, his expression somber but guarded. Jennings was there too, precise and correct, though his eyes were shadowed. Poirot looked at them one by one, his head tilted slightly, as though they were portraits in a gallery and he, the critic, must appraise each stroke of paint. "My friends," he began, his accent curling each syllable, "a crime has been committed. It is not for me to direct the investigation, that is for the inspector here. But permit me to put one or two little questions. They are nothing, mere trifles. Yet, as I have often said, it is in the trifles that truth reveals herself." He turned to Charles Harrington. "Monsieur, you were in the smoking room this morning, n'est-ce pas?" Charles gave a quick nod. "Yes." "Writing a letter. And smoking." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Yes, yes, a cigar." "Ah, and the ash." Poirot's eyes glistened. "Did you by chance carry it upon your coat, your shoes, to the lawn?" Charles colored. "Certainly not. I remained indoors." Poirot inclined his head, saying nothing further. He looked to Clara. "Madam, you walked in the rose garden." "Alone?" "Yes." Her voice was quiet. "You did not, then, see Mademoiselle Evelyn?" Clara hesitated. "No." "Curious. The garden is near to the south lawn, is it not? And Mademoiselle was fond of the air." His eyes lingered upon her for a moment, then moved on. He addressed Beatrice. "Mademoiselle, it was you who discovered the body. Before that, you noticed what precisely?" Beatrice considered. "The shoe, the bracelet, the abrasion on the bark." Poirot's mustache twitched approvingly. "Exact, precise. You have the eye, mademoiselle." Colonel Redmayne bristled. "All this quizzing, it's the inspector's job. I was in the library, reading the Times. That's all." "Mais oui," said Poirot softly. "Reading so intently that you did not raise your head to the window, even when the stable clock struck the half-hour." The colonel frowned. "I did not." Poirot nodded, as though the answer satisfied him. Then he turned to Dr. Forbes. "Doctor, you were abroad at the hour?" "I was on my way to Mrs. Chalmers." "She will confirm it." "Of course. And yet, between your departure and your arrival, a little time is unaccounted for, n'est-ce pas?" The doctor's lips thinned. "I took the meadow path. It is longer." Poirot accepted this with a small bow. At last he addressed Jennings. "And you, mon ami, you are the eyes and ears of this house. What did you observe?" The butler, with careful dignity, replied, "Only that the French windows were unlatched at 7:30, sir. That, and the cup with lipstick on the side table." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Indeed. A careless cup, a careless latch. Small things, yes, but how they speak. We shall see, we shall see." Inspector Barnes cleared his throat impatiently. "Monsieur Poirot, this line of questions may interest you, but—" Poirot raised a hand. "Forgive me. I intrude no further. I make the little observations, that is all. Perhaps, in time, they will be of service." The group dispersed slowly, each carrying away a burden heavier than before. Poirot remained by the window, his eyes fixed upon the oak. His voice, when he spoke softly to Lady Margaret, was grave. "Madam, I have seen many trees, but few so ancient, so solemn. Beneath such branches, men do not lie by accident. There is design here, and design always reveals the designer. It will not be long before we see the pattern." Lady Margaret looked at him, her face set. "Monsieur Poirot, if you can find that pattern, you will do me a service beyond measure. For Evelyn was dear to me. And I fear," she broke off, her voice hardening, "I fear the enemy is not far from this house." Poirot bowed his head, his mustache quivering. "It is always so, madam. The serpent lies coiled at our feet, never in the distant jungle." Outside, the oak stood silent, its branches swaying slightly in the breeze, as though it listened too. Would you like me to make Chapter 3 the first round of deeper interrogations by Poirot, where he begins noticing the subtle contradictions in the alibis? Or would you prefer the focus to shift first to Inspector Barnes pursuing his own suspect, before Poirot quietly undermines him? Inspector Barnes was a man who preferred simple crimes. A burglary was plain enough. A quarrel turned ugly had the merit of being obvious. Murder within a wealthy household was, to his mind, a tangle of motives that were both too many and too subtle. Still, he was determined to proceed in the old, steady fashion. Interview, confirm, accuse if need be. Poirot, standing discreetly by with his fingertips together, made no move to obstruct. He only listened, and in listening, his little gray cells began to stir. The household was assembled once more in the drawing room. Curtains were half drawn against the bright day, lending the chamber a somber quality. Lady Margaret presided from a high-backed chair, her posture as rigid as ever. Charles and Clara sat side by side upon the sofa, though their bodies leaned subtly away from one another. Colonel Redmayne placed himself near the hearth, leaning on his stick as though prepared to repulse an attack. Dr. Forbes stood at the rear, his hands clasped behind him, while Beatrice Latham, notebook in hand, arranged herself so that she could observe without appearing to do so. Jennings moved soundlessly, serving tea which no one drank. "Let us begin," said Inspector Barnes, clearing his throat. "We must have your movements in detail, one by one. Mr. Harrington, Charles. You say you were in the smoking room from 20 to 9 until 20 past 10. You wrote a letter. To whom?" Charles smiled, though his lips tightened first. "A friend in London. Business matters." "I did not finish it." "You have the letter." He hesitated, then produced a single sheet, folded once. Barnes took it, scanning quickly. A handful of lines, vague, unfinished, with a blot of ink near the middle. No address. No signature. He looked up sharply. "You didn't intend to post this?" Charles's smile hardened. "I lost my train of thought. Surely you don't mean to suggest a man must post every letter he begins?" From the corner, Poirot's mustaches twitched. Barnes ignored him. "And the cigar?" "Jennings says you left the smoking room at 9:15, went into the hall, fetched a blotter from the library, then returned." "Yes," Charles agreed quickly. "Quite right. You were gone how long?" 2 minutes, no more." Barnes made a note. Poirot, however, had tilted his head. "Pardon, monsieur," he interjected, "but the blotter, did you in fact return it to the library?" Charles flushed faintly. "No, I forgot." "Curious," murmured Poirot, "to remember to take but not to restore. It suggests haste, does it not?" The inspector shot him a look, but Poirot bowed apologetically and fell silent. Barnes turned to Clara. "Madam, you say you walked in the rose garden from 9:05 until 10. Alone?" "Yes." "You saw nothing unusual? Heard nothing?" Clara hesitated the barest fraction of a second. "Nothing." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "But you pricked your hand on a thorn, did you not, madam? You have covered it cleverly with a glove, but the mark shows faintly." Her composure wavered. "It is nothing, an accident." "Bien sûr," said Poirot softly. "So many accidents in one morning." Inspector Barnes pressed on. "Colonel Redmayne, you remained in the library until the half-hour struck." "Yes." "Reading the Times." The colonel's mustache bristled. "You may examine me on the leader if you wish. I remember it word for word." Barnes obliged. The colonel recited, somewhat pompously, the opening of a long editorial on foreign policy. Satisfied, the inspector nodded. Poirot, however, raised an eyebrow. "And yet, Colonel, you did not hear Miss Grant cry out? Not even a gasp, a scuffle, a sound of struggle? With the window so near." The colonel shifted. "I was absorbed in the paper." Poirot inclined his head, but his eyes gleamed. Dr. Forbes was next. "You left at 9, doctor, and arrived at Mrs. Chalmers's at 10 to 10. Why the delay?" "I took the meadow path," Forbes answered smoothly. "It is longer, but more pleasant." Barnes frowned. "The difference is 20 minutes." Forbes shrugged. "I dawdled." Poirot leaned forward, his voice quiet. "Doctor, forgive me. You say you dawdled. And yet Mrs. Chalmers observed you looking at your watch with some agitation. Is it not so?" Forbes stiffened, then said, A man may dawdle and still keep account of time. Poirot smiled faintly, letting the matter rest. At last Beatrice was questioned. She repeated her account with precision, leaving the study at 9, crossing the lawn by 20 past, discovering the shoe, the bracelet, and then the body. Barnes seemed content. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "And mademoiselle," he asked, "you noticed details so exact. Tell me, did you observe the cup with the lipstick before or after breakfast?" "After," she replied, "when the room was cleared." Poirot's mustaches twitched again. Bon. A useful observation. The inspector concluded by noting Jennings's evidence about the unlatched windows and the lipstick cup. When all had been said, he rose. "Very well. I shall review these statements with my men. One among you, make no mistake, is not speaking the truth. And I will find out who." The household dispersed slowly, relief and dread mingling in the air. Poirot lingered at the window, gazing at the oak. Hastings was not present to hear, but had he been, he might have thought Poirot spoke to himself when he murmured, "They lie, these good people. They lie, some with purpose, some without. But the lies, they are not equal. One is heavy, one is light. And it is in the weight of the lie that the murderer betrays himself." The afternoon at Greystone hung heavy, as though the air itself had absorbed the dread that now infused the house. Rain clouds gathered distantly over the fields, a faint promise of storm. Within, silence reigned except for the subdued movements of servants and the occasional creak of a floorboard under cautious steps. Poirot had requested, with his usual courtesy but unmistakable firmness, that he be allowed to conduct private interviews. Inspector Barnes, though irked, agreed, if only to prove that the little Belgian's famed methods would yield no more than his own. Lady Margaret granted the use of the small morning parlour, its chintz-covered chairs and low writing desk a genteel setting for what, in truth, would be a dissection of souls. The first summoned was Charles Harrington. He entered with a defiant air, as though determined to treat the matter lightly. Poirot received him with impeccable politeness, offering a seat and a cup of coffee. "You are kind," Charles said, taking the cup though his hand trembled faintly. "I suppose this is the customary interrogation?" Poirot smiled. "Not interrogation, monsieur. Merely conversation. I like to know those who were near the one who is dead. It tells me not what happened, perhaps, but what could have happened." Charles shifted uneasily. "I have already told Inspector Barnes. I was in the smoking room." "Ah yes, the letter. To a friend in London. You did not complete it." "Why?" Charles's eyes flickered. "I was interrupted." "By what?" "By Jennings. I went to fetch a blotter." "I told you." Poirot's gaze lingered on him. "And you did not return the blotter. It is curious, no? The neat man, he restores what he borrows. The careless man, he forgets. But the man who is interrupted by something of consequence, he too forgets." Charles flushed. "I fail to see your meaning." Poirot leaned forward, his voice low. "Monsieur, you are in difficulties, are you not? Financial ones. Gambling, perhaps. Investments gone awry." Charles's composure wavered. "That is no business of yours." "On the contrary," Poirot murmured, "it is the business of murder. Money, love, jealousy, these are the roots, always. But do not fear, monsieur. I do not accuse. I only observe." Charles stood abruptly. "If you have no further questions." Poirot inclined his head. "For the moment, no." When Charles had gone, Poirot sat quite still, eyes half closed, as though filing away a piece of a puzzle. Clara Harrington entered next. She was pale, her hands clasped tightly before her. Poirot greeted her with grave courtesy. "Madam, forgive me. It is not pleasant, this inquisition. Yet it is necessary." She nodded. "I understand. You walked in the rose garden this morning. Alone?" "Yes." "You saw nothing?" "No," her eyes faltered. "Nothing of importance." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Ah, there is then something, but you judge it not important. Tell me, madam." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "I thought I heard voices. Near the oak. A man's, low. And Evelyn's laugh. I went the other way. I did not wish to intrude. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Très bien, madame. You are honest now. You did not tell the inspector this. No. I was afraid it would sound like gossip. And my husband, She stopped herself. Your husband is jealous? Poirot asked softly. Her lips pressed tight. She neither confirmed nor denied. Poirot, with tact, let the silence speak for her. When she departed, Poirot sat motionless for some time, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on nothing. Beatrice Latham came next, calm and self-contained. Her notebook was tucked under her arm. You are observant, mademoiselle, Poirot said warmly. You noticed the shoe, the bracelet, the bark. Tell me, what else did you notice? Something small, perhaps overlooked. Beatrice considered. There was a faint scent, I thought, bitter almonds. Only for an instant. Poirot's mustaches twitched. Poison, mademoiselle. Hydrocyanic acid. But why, when she was strangled? Beatrice met his gaze steadily. That, Monsieur Poirot, is your puzzle. Poirot laughed softly. Ah, you are formidable, mademoiselle. You see much. She allowed herself the smallest smile. Colonel Redmayne clumped in afterwards, impatient. I've nothing to add, sir. I was in the library, and that's an end to it. Poirot regarded him. You are a man of discipline, mon colonel. You remember the leader in the Times. But discipline, it can be a mask, yes? You heard nothing, saw nothing? Not even Miss Grant crossing the lawn. The colonel's mustache bristled. I mind my own affairs. Just so, said Poirot gently. And yet, sometimes, in minding our own, we see too much of others. The colonel growled but said no more. Dr. Forbes entered last, his expression guarded. Poirot received him gravely. Doctor, you know death. You examined the body. Tell me, was the scarf tied with knowledge? By one who understands the throat. Forbes frowned. The knot was deliberate, firm. Whoever tied it knew how to strangle. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A doctor's knowledge? Or a soldier's? Forbes stiffened. Many could do it. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, many could, but few would. That is the difference. When the doctor had gone, Poirot remained alone. He stood, smoothing his immaculate mustaches, and walked to the window. The oak loomed against the gathering clouds, its branches swaying. They lie, he murmured to himself. Each has his secret, his fear. But one alone has the courage to kill. It is there, in the silence between their words. The oak has seen it. Soon so shall I. At that moment, the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the countryside. Inspector Barnes was a man who valued a straight path. To his mind, the case already inclined towards one answer, and he meant to take it. By late afternoon, with the clouds low and the light turning sullen, he summoned Charles Harrington into the library. The rest of the household gathered in whispers outside, for such summonses rarely boded well. Charles entered with forced bravado, though the quick glance of his eyes betrayed unease. Barnes sat squarely behind the desk, papers neatly arrayed before him. Mr. Harrington, he began, your account does not sit comfortably with the evidence. You say you remained in the smoking room, yet Jennings saw you cross the hall at 9:15. Cigar in hand. Yes, Charles admitted. I went for a blotter. Barnes's eyes narrowed. And you left cigar ash in the library. Ash of the same brand you smoked this morning. We found it near the oak as well. Charles stiffened. Ash? On the lawn? Impossible. The inspector leaned forward. You were in debt, were you not? Gambling, speculation, whichever you choose to call it. Miss Grant had recently come into her inheritance. She was lively, generous. Did you approach her for money? Did she refuse? Charles flushed scarlet. That is a vile insinuation. Perhaps you sought more than money, Barnes pressed. Perhaps you sought her affection. Your wife may not have understood. Enough. Charles's voice cracked. I did not touch Evelyn. I was in the smoking room. If ash is found outside, Then someone else carried it there. Barnes sat back, lips tight. It is a convenient defense. You had means, you had motive, and you were unaccounted for at the crucial time. Through all of this, Poirot stood near the window, silent. At last he spoke, softly, almost apologetically. "Permit me, Inspector, a little word. The ash. You say it is of Monsieur's cigar. Perhaps. But ash, it is a traitor, yes? The wind, it carries it, it drops it. A speck upon the lawn. Ah, it is too little for proof." Barnes grunted. Then what of the debts? The half-finished letter? The suspicious absence? Poirot turned his bright eyes upon Charles. "Monsieur, let us be precise. At 9:15 you went to the library. You fetched the blotter. At that hour, Evelyn still lived. Dr. Forbes places her death closer to 10. So, if you killed her, it was later. Tell me, monsieur, after you returned to the smoking room, did you remain there?" Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. At last he muttered, "Yes, I remained there." Poirot's gaze lingered, thoughtful. The truth, it slips. But not yet does it fall. Lady Margaret entered at that moment, tall and forbidding. "Inspector Barnes," she said with cool authority, "you will not accuse my nephew without certainty. Suspicion is not proof." Barnes inclined his head, though his jaw tightened. "We shall see, my lady. We shall see." When Charles had gone, Lady Margaret turned to Poirot. "Monsieur, what do you think?" Poirot's mustaches twitched. "I think, madam, that the case is too neat. Monsieur Harrington has debts, yes. He smokes, yes. He is a man who fears discovery. But the murderer, he is not clumsy. He does not scatter ash like confetti. He does not tie a scarf with a knot of skill and leave the rest to chance. Non. There is more here." Lady Margaret's eyes darkened. "Then you believe Charles innocent?" Poirot spread his hands. "I believe only that appearances are designed. Someone wishes Monsieur to appear guilty. That, to Hercule Poirot, is most interesting." Outside, the first drops of rain fell against the window panes. The oak swayed, its branches restless in the rising wind, as though impatient for the truth to be spoken. Poirot, watching it, murmured, "Soon the mask will slip. For lies, they are like the leaves, they cannot cling when the storm begins." The storm that evening broke with a suddenness that startled even those long accustomed to English weather. A crack of lightning lit the vast oak in stark silhouette against the gray sky, and thunder rolled across the valley like artillery. Rain fell in torrents, drumming against the windows of Greystone, sluicing down the terrace, making rivers of the gravel paths. The house was sealed, each member of its household gathered within, compelled into uneasy proximity. Poirot, immaculate as ever despite the weather's violence, sat near the fireplace of the drawing-room. His little eyes, bright and inquisitive, roved constantly. He had been restless since the late afternoon, turning matters over in his mind. And at last, he excused himself from the company and asked Jennings to show him once more the scarf, the bracelet, and the other items collected near the oak. The inspector, though weary of the little man's interruptions, grudgingly agreed. They went together to the small study, where the evidence lay under lock. Poirot, with a delicate hand, examined the silken scarf. He smoothed its length carefully across the desk, his fingers pausing at the knot which had been untied and preserved. He bent close, inhaling. "Ah!" he murmured. "It is there still, the faintest trace. Bitter almonds. Very faint." Inspector Barnes frowned. "Poison, you think? But the doctor said strangulation." "Just so," Poirot replied softly. "But strangulation is certain. Poison, only suggested. Yet why should a scarf carry the scent? A scarf does not drink poison by accident." He turned his attention to the bracelet. The clasp was broken, its jagged edge sharp. Poirot, ever fastidious, took out a small magnifying lens. Under the light, he studied the metal. "You see, Inspector," he said, "the clasp, it did not simply snap. It was wrenched. There is a little trace here, the faintest fiber, cotton, I think. Not from the dress of Mademoiselle Evelyn. From another garment, coarser." Barnes looked doubtful. And what does that prove? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Poirot's eyes gleamed. It suggests a struggle, yes. But also proximity. Someone very near to her, close enough to seize her wrist, to break the clasp. Someone whose sleeve brushed against it. Barnes made a note, though he still looked unconvinced. Poirot next considered the piece of bark with the pale abrasion. He leaned closer, his eyes intent. The mark, too smooth to be chance. Something scraped against it. A button, perhaps. Or the edge of a ring. The inspector muttered, "We've a dozen buttons among them all." Poirot only smiled. "Ah, but one button will tell the truth. It is in such small matters, mon ami, that the murderer betrays himself." They returned the items to their box. Poirot stood by the window, gazing at the storm-lashed oak. "Consider, Inspector," he said softly. "The murderer wished us to believe it simple. A scarf tied, a young woman strangled, a nephew with debts, a cigar's ash. Too simple. Non, the true story hides in the details. The scent upon the scarf, the fiber at the clasp, the scrape upon the bark. These are the things that speak. They whisper of a scene more subtle, more cunning." Barnes gave a grunt. "If you've a theory, Poirot, best speak it plain." Poirot shook his head, his mustaches twitching. "Not yet. The little gray cells, they arrange themselves. Soon the picture will form. Until then, patience." That evening, as the storm beat down, the household gathered unwillingly in the great hall. The atmosphere was strained, conversation faltering. Charles paced by the fireplace, his face drawn. Clara sat apart, her gaze lowered, hands folded too tightly in her lap. Colonel Redmayne blustered about military campaigns, but his words carried no conviction. Beatrice watched quietly, noting every flicker of expression. Dr. Forbes remained in shadow, silent, his features unreadable. Poirot moved among them, offering a word here, a smile there, as though merely a guest at a gathering. Yet his eyes missed nothing. Clara's quick glance at her husband when Evelyn's name was spoken, Charles's hand that trembled when he raised a glass, the colonel's unease when asked about the Times article, the doctor's stern gaze when the scarf was mentioned. At length, Poirot seated himself near Lady Margaret. The storm rattled the windows. He spoke quietly, so that only she heard. "Madam, it is as I said. One of those in this room carries a secret heavier than the rest. The scarf, the bracelet, the tree, they are not silent. They tell me so. Soon I will ask the questions that pierce the veil." Lady Margaret's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the oak visible in the lightning's glare. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "when you do, I fear the truth will be more dreadful than we imagine." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "The truth, madam, is always dreadful. But it is better than the lie." And outside, as if to seal his words, lightning split the sky once more, and the oak stood illuminated, vast, ancient, waiting. The storm passed in the night, leaving Greystone draped in a damp stillness. Mist clung to the lawns, and the great oak loomed like a sentinel, its branches dripping from the rain. Within the manor, the atmosphere was more oppressive still. Grief had not yet settled into silence. Suspicion had already taken its place. At breakfast, conversation was brittle. Lady Margaret presided with iron composure, pouring tea with a hand that did not shake. Charles attempted a jest about the weather, but his laugh rang hollow and no one replied. Clara kept her eyes fixed upon her plate, eating nothing. Colonel Redmayne thundered about the failure of modern drainage, and Dr. Forbes corrected him with sharpness unusual in the genial village physician. Beatrice said little, but her pencil moved upon her ever-present notebook, as though recording a ledger invisible to the rest. Poirot, immaculate in a grey suit, observed each with his customary delicacy. He said nothing until Jennings, pale and grave, entered to whisper in Lady Margaret's ear. She stiffened, then turned to the table. "There has been a discovery," she said slowly. "Jennings, tell them." The butler bowed. "This morning, in clearing the terrace after the storm, we found a small vial lodged against the stone steps. Empty, save for a faint residue. The doctor has seen it." All eyes turned to Dr. Forbes. He cleared his throat. It contained prussic acid, hydrocyanic, a deadly poison. A murmur rippled through the company. Charles swore under his breath. Clara grew paler still. The colonel muttered, "Good God." Beatrice alone seemed calm, though her pencil moved more swiftly. Poirot raised a hand. "And you, Doctor, what do you conclude?" Forbes frowned. "That Evelyn may have been poisoned before the scarf was tied. Or at least, an attempt was made. The smell of almonds, that explains it." "Just so," said Poirot softly. "But tell me, this vial, it was upon the terrace. That is curious, is it not? If it were used by the murderer, why abandon it so near? Unless it was meant to be found." The words fell into the silence like stones into a pond. Charles sprang up, agitated. "You mean someone planted it? To throw suspicion?" Poirot inclined his head. "Precisely, monsieur. A false trail. Very convenient. But convenient for whom?" Lady Margaret rose abruptly. "I will not have open accusation at my table. Jennings, clear the service." Her command brooked no defiance. Yet the silence that followed was heavy with accusation unspoken. Later that morning, Poirot sought Clara in the rose garden. She stood alone, her figure still against the dew-bright blossoms. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "you are troubled." She looked at him, her eyes hollow. "I cannot endure it. The house, the whispers. Charles is accused at every turn. And yet—" She broke off, trembling. Poirot's voice was soft. "And yet you doubt him." She pressed her hands together. "Evelyn was beautiful. Charles admired her, I know. He admired her too much. He had debts, she had money. But he is weak, not cruel. I cannot believe he would kill." Poirot regarded her keenly. "And you, madam? You said yesterday you heard voices. Evelyn's laugh, and a man's. Was it Charles?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, "No, it was not his voice. I know my husband's tone. This was lower, rougher." "Ah!" Poirot's eyes glistened. "Very good. You have helped more than you know." That afternoon, a confrontation broke the fragile calm. Colonel Redmayne, red-faced, accused Charles in the hall. "You were seen, sir, seen near the oak. Your ash lies there. Your debts, your motives. Don't think you can bluster out of this." Charles retorted furiously. "Better a debtor than a liar. You, Colonel, claim you sat with your Times, yet who can swear you did? You've the strength to strangle, more than I. And your stick, where was it when Evelyn died?" The colonel raised his cane, his mustache bristling. "How dare you? Gentlemen!" Lady Margaret's voice cut sharp as steel. "Enough. I will not have brawling under my roof." But the damage was done. The household fractured openly, Charles pacing the corridors in restless agitation, Clara sinking further into despair, the colonel glowering at all who crossed his path. Dr. Forbes withdrew into icy reserve, while Beatrice moved silently, observing, recording, waiting. Poirot, watching all, murmured to himself, "The lies begin to crack. Soon, the truth beneath will be laid bare. For when tempers flare, the tongue slips and the mask falls." That night, alone in his chamber, he laid out his notes with meticulous care. One by one, he arranged the trifles: the unlatched windows, the cup with lipstick, the fiber at the bracelet, the scrape upon the bark, the scent upon the scarf, the planted vial. Each was a piece of the puzzle. Slowly, the picture was forming. And beneath it all, one thought returned to him again and again. The murderer was not merely cunning but cruel, cruel enough to weave a double deception, first by poison, then by strangulation. Poirot's mustaches quivered as he whispered, "Mon Dieu! To kill twice is to reveal much of the soul." The oak outside stirred in the night breeze, as though it too listened. The morning after the storm dawned clear, with a pale, washed light falling across the lawns. The oak tree stood somber and unmoved, its dripping branches glistening in the new sun. Yet within Greystone Manor, there was no sense of renewal. Suspicion had seated itself too deeply. Faces were drawn, voices strained. The murder had torn away the delicate veil of civility that Lady Margaret so fiercely guarded. Poirot, having taken his customary coffee with toast and honey, moved quietly about the house. He had learned long ago that in the aftermath of violence, men and women betray themselves most, not in the grand declarations, but in the weary silences, the sudden flashes of emotion. He watched. He listened. It was Clara Harrington who broke first. She had been pale and subdued since Evelyn's death, but that morning her restraint snapped. Poirot found her in the music room, seated at the piano with her hands poised over the keys. No sound came. Instead, her shoulders shook. "Madam," Poirot said gently, "you grieve." She turned sharply. "Do not speak to me, Monsieur Poirot. I cannot bear it." Poirot inclined his head. "Then I shall sit only. When words are heavy, silence may be lighter." For a moment she said nothing. Then, as if something within her gave way, she whispered, "It is unbearable, this watching, this whispering. They think it is Charles. Everyone does. I do not know what to believe." Poirot's eyes glistened. "You are torn, madam, between loyalty and doubt." Her voice rose. "Yes. He lied to me. He said he never spoke to Evelyn alone, never admired her. But I saw the way he looked at her. And I heard her laugh with someone near the oak. It was not Charles, I told you. But what if I am wrong? What if it was?" She pressed her hands to her face, weeping openly now. Poirot remained still, his gaze tender but unrelenting. "Courage, madam," he said softly. "To doubt is human. To seek truth, that is strength." You heard a man's voice, low, rough. "Trust your memory. It was not your husband. That is important." Clara shuddered. If it was not Charles, then who? Poirot leaned forward, his voice low. "That, madam, is the question I too ask. And soon the answer will come. But you must hold to what you know, not what fear tells you." She sobbed quietly, then nodded. Poirot left her with dignity preserved, though her breakdown had given him much. A voice, a laugh, a moment too easily dismissed now cast its shadow upon another. Later that day, another crack appeared. Colonel Redmayne, blustering in the hall, cornered Dr. Forbes with an accusation. "You, sir, you had the poison in your hands. Who else would carry such vile stuff? Who else could contrive such a method?" Forbes drew himself up, his voice cold. "It is true. I keep such compounds for my work. But prussic acid is dangerous even to store. I keep mine locked. Someone took it." "Ha!" the colonel barked. "A fine excuse. Perhaps you used it yourself and then hid behind your profession." Dr. Forbes's face reddened. "How dare you? I have attended this family for 20 years. Do you think I would betray their trust? It is monstrous. Monstrous or not, you had the means." The quarrel escalated until Lady Margaret herself intervened, her voice cutting like a blade. "Enough. This house will not descend into a madhouse. Colonel, Doctor, you will conduct yourselves with restraint or you will leave." The silence that followed was brittle. Each man retreated, but the damage lingered. Forbes, shaken, muttered something about preparing a statement for Inspector Barnes. The colonel limped heavily into the library, his stick striking the floor with angry force. Poirot, who had witnessed the scene with quiet attention, murmured, "Ah, pride and anger, they show us the truth even when words do not." The doctor, he defends his honor too fiercely. The colonel, he accuses too swiftly. Both protest, but one of them knows more than he has said. That evening, Poirot gathered Lady Margaret, Beatrice, and Jennings in the drawing room. The others had withdrawn early, leaving only these three. He spoke softly, as if confiding rather than interrogating. "Madam," he said to Lady Margaret, "forgive me, but in this house there are secrets. Secrets of money, of love, of pride. They weigh heavily. Already we have seen how suspicion breaks the spirit. Madam Harrington is in despair. Dr. Forbes quarrels. The colonel rages. Soon, someone will falter. Already, the cracks appear." Beatrice, her eyes keen, leaned forward. "Do you mean one of them will confess?" Poirot's mustaches twitched. "Not a confession, mademoiselle. A slip. The tongue, it betrays when the heart is under strain. Already Madame Harrington has given me a little truth. Soon, another will do the same. Lady Margaret's gaze was steady. And when they do, Poirot bowed his head. Then, Madame, Hercule Poirot will be ready. Outside, the oak tree stood dark against the moonlit sky, and in its branches the wind whispered as though in agreement. By the following evening, the house was like a stage set for tragedy. Lamps burned low in the drawing room, their glow casting long shadows across the paneled walls. The storm had gone, but the air remained charged with the aftertaste of thunder. Each member of the household carried their unease like an invisible weight. Poirot had waited for this moment, when nerves were raw, patience exhausted, and suspicion biting at every glance. He entered the room with a kind of ceremony, his step precise, his mustaches gleaming in the lamplight. Inspector Barnes was already there, dour and reluctant, yet compelled to observe. Lady Margaret sat upright in her chair, a figure of iron dignity. Charles lounged uneasily on the sofa, cigar unlit in his hand. Clara sat beside him, pale as marble, her gaze lowered. Colonel Redmayne stood near the fireplace, leaning on his stick, bristling with indignation. Dr. Forbes hovered in shadow, arms crossed tightly. Beatrice, with her notebook, positioned herself where she could see all. Jennings lingered discreetly at the sideboard, as always invisible yet indispensable. Poirot cleared his throat softly. Mesdames et Messieurs, I have asked you to gather because the time has come. For 2 days I have observed. I have listened. And now, I will pose to you certain questions. They are simple, but they have teeth. They will bite if the answers are false. A silence fell. The tick of the mantel clock was suddenly loud. Poirot's eyes turned first to Charles. Monsieur, you insist you remained in the smoking room, yes? Yet no one saw you there after 9:30. Your debts are large, your needs pressing. Tell me, why should we not believe that you sought to persuade Mademoiselle Evelyn of generosity? Charles flushed. Because it is not true. Yes, I admired her. Who did not? But she would never have given me money. And he broke off, glancing at his wife. I did not kill her. I swear it. Poirot nodded gravely, but pressed no further. Instead, his gaze shifted to Clara. Madam, you heard voices. Evelyn's laugh, and a man's voice. You did not tell the inspector at first. Why? Clara's lips trembled. Because I feared it would condemn Charles. But it was not his voice. It was deeper, rougher. Poirot's eyes flickered toward the colonel, then the doctor. A soldier's voice, perhaps, or a man accustomed to command. The colonel stiffened. If you mean me, sir, I say you are mistaken. I was in the library, reading the Times. I heard nothing. Poirot's mustaches quivered. Curious, Colonel. You recite the leader word for word, and yet you hear nothing outside. Too much memory, perhaps. It is possible to remember too well. The colonel banged his stick. Damn it, I'm no liar. Poirot raised a hand, calm. Then we will move on. Dr. Forbes, this vial of poison. It belonged to you. You say it was stolen. By whom? Forbes's voice was low, tight. I do not know. I keep my medicines locked. Someone must have forced the drawer. Poirot leaned forward. But why abandon it so conveniently upon the terrace? No, doctor. That was theater. A false trail. And who better to suggest poison than the physician? And yet, the scarf killed her, not the vial. Why? Because the poison failed, or because the murderer wished to double the deception? Forbes's face reddened. You imply much, Monsieur Poirot. Too much. Poirot's gaze swept the room. And now I ask you all, who tied the scarf? A knot such as that is no accident. It was firm, deliberate, practiced. Who among you knows such knots? A soldier? A sailor? A doctor? There was a stir. The colonel's hand tightened on his stick. The doctor's jaw clenched. Charles shifted uneasily. Beatrice alone met Poirot's eyes steadily, her pencil unmoving. Poirot smiled faintly. You see, as Amos, the truth presses upon us. Each of you hides something. Madame Harrington hides her fear. Monsieur Charles hides his debts. The Colonel hides his movements. The doctor hides his knowledge. Even Mademoiselle Beatrice, she hides her keen understanding. But the murderer hides most of all. And it is in hiding too much that he betrays himself. He rose suddenly, his small frame radiating authority. Tomorrow, I shall ask you to gather once more, beneath the oak tree itself. There, before its ancient witness, I will show you the truth. Until then, I warn you, speak carefully, act carefully. For the net is closing. The room stirred with uneasy murmurs. Lady Margaret's eyes blazed with something between fear and resolve. The Colonel muttered angrily, Charles swore under his breath, Clara looked close to fainting. Dr. Forbes turned away, his face shadowed. Only Beatrice watched Poirot with a curious calm, as though she alone understood the play about to be staged. Poirot smoothed his mustaches. Yes, he said softly. Tomorrow, the little gray cells will speak. And when they speak, the murderer will have no more lies to tell. Outside, the oak loomed dark against the moon, patient, eternal, waiting for its role as the final stage. The following morning dawned pale and cold, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over Greystone. Mist curled low across the lawns, muffling sound, and the oak tree loomed out of the whiteness with a majesty both solemn and sinister. Jennings, under Poirot's instruction, had set chairs in a semicircle at the base of its trunk. It was here, beneath those ancient branches, that the little Belgian declared he would make clear the picture. The household assembled reluctantly. Lady Margaret came first, straight-backed and formidable despite the pallor of her face. Charles followed, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, eyes darting nervously. Clara, pale as ever, leaned upon his arm, though the distance between their bodies spoke of estrangement. Colonel Redmayne thumped forward with his stick, bristling at the indignity of it all. Dr. Forbes arrived last, expression grim, lips pressed tight. Beatrice took her seat quietly, notebook balanced on her knee, her calm gaze betraying neither fear nor hope. Inspector Barnes stood off to one side, notebook in hand, skepticism writ plain upon his heavy features. Poirot, immaculate as though he had stepped out of a salon rather than across damp grass, stood before them. He raised his hand, and silence fell. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, we gather here because this tree has witnessed what none of us wished to see. Here, Mademoiselle Evelyn Grant met her death. Here, lies and alibis were woven together like branches. But truth, she is stubborn, she will not remain hidden. Today, I untangle the knots. He turned first to Charles. Monsieur, you were an easy suspect. Your debts, your cigar ash, your unfinished letter, they all pointed to you. Too easily, n'est-ce pas? The ash could be planted, the debts exaggerated, the letter a mere half-truth. You were meant to appear guilty. But the murderer, he is clever. He knows the police look for the obvious. You, monsieur, were the decoy. Charles let out a strangled laugh. At last, someone says it. I told you, Inspector. Do not rejoice too soon, Poirot cut in sharply. You have lied, monsieur. You left the smoking room longer than you claimed. You went near the oak. You spoke to Evelyn that morning. Your wife heard her laugh, and a man's voice, yours. But you did not kill her. Your lie was one of vanity, not of blood. Charles sank back, face ashen. Clara's hand trembled upon her lap. Poirot's gaze swept to the Colonel. Colonel Redmayne, you hide behind your times. You recite the words as though they were scripture. But a man does not read so intently that he hears nothing, sees nothing. You saw Evelyn cross the lawn. You may even have seen with whom she spoke. But you held your tongue, for reasons of pride, or of guilt. The Colonel's mustache bristled. I tell you, sir, I was in the library. Oui, Poirot said softly. But not all the time. Then he turned to Dr. Forbes. And you, doctor, the vial of prussic acid, your responsibility. You tell us it was stolen. Perhaps. But it was abandoned too neatly upon the terrace. A false trail, yes, but whose hand placed it there? Yours, perhaps, to shield another? Or, was it placed to shield you? Forbes's face reddened. I had no reason to harm Evelyn. I cared for her as I cared for all this household. Poirot's eyes gleamed. No reason, but reasons abound. Evelyn, she knew something dangerous. She threatened, perhaps, to reveal it. And you, Doctor, are a man accustomed to control. To have your authority challenged, that is dangerous. He turned at last to Beatrice. His tone softened. Mademoiselle Latham, you have watched with a keen eye. You noted the shoe, the bracelet, the bark. You even noticed the faint scent of almonds upon the scarf. You see much, but you say little. Tell me, why did you not tell the inspector sooner of what you observed? Beatrice's eyes flickered, but her voice remained steady. Because I wished to be certain. Because, perhaps, I did not trust the inspector to understand. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. Or perhaps, mademoiselle, you too have secrets. There was a stir among the company. Clara gasped faintly. Lady Margaret's lips tightened. The colonel muttered something under his breath. Poirot raised both hands. Patience. I accuse no one, yet. But consider what we know. Evelyn was to meet someone at the Oak. She laughed. There was a voice, low, rough. There was a struggle. The bracelet broke. A fiber was caught. A scrape was left upon the bark. Poison was tried, then strangulation. 2 attempts. That is not chance. That is desperation. He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. Then, in a voice suddenly sharp, the murderer is here, among us. Tomorrow, I shall lay before you the chain entire, link by link, until the guilty one stands revealed. Tonight, I shall think with my little gray cells. But know this, already the pattern is complete. Only the final thread remains to be pulled. The company rose in unease. Charles wiped sweat from his brow. Clara clutched her shawl tightly. The colonel muttered angrily about theatrics. Forbes walked stiffly back to the house, his face unreadable. Beatrice lingered, her gaze fixed upon Poirot as though she wished to challenge him, yet said nothing. Lady Margaret alone stood calm, her eyes on the oak. Poirot remained a moment longer, gazing at the scarred bark of the tree. He touched it lightly with his gloved hand. Yes, he whispered. You have seen it, mon vieux. Tomorrow, so shall they. The oak, vast and silent, gave no reply. The night before the reckoning was long and heavy. Greystone Manor, though vast, seemed to press in on itself with a suffocating stillness. The servants moved quietly, whispering when they must speak at all. The household retired early, yet none, perhaps, found sleep easily. For every step in the corridors creaked too loudly, and every door seemed to close with accusation in its echo. Poirot, alone in his chamber, did not seek rest. He had laid out upon the small writing desk the trifles he had noted, a sketch of the oak and its roots, a small scrap of cotton fiber retrieved from the bracelet's clasp, the photograph of the scarf's knot, a diagram of the lawn with times carefully annotated. To Hastings, had he been present, Poirot would have called these the silly little things, mon ami. Yet it was these little things that, assembled, formed a picture more vivid than any witness's account. At 11 o'clock, when the house lay quiet, Poirot took his cane and walked the length of the south terrace. The moon was clear, the mist lifting, and the oak rose before him like a monument carved from the centuries. He moved slowly, inspecting the grass, the terrace stones, the path curving toward the rose garden. He stooped now and then, not to collect anything, for all had already been taken, but to study the lie of the land, the distance from terrace to tree, the angles from which a figure might approach unseen. At the base of the oak he paused, gazing at the bark where the pale scrape marked the place of struggle. His gloved fingers traced the scar. So, he murmured, you tell me she was seized from behind. And yet, the knot, it was tied from the front. The scarf pulled tight, yes, but knotted as though the murderer faced her. He tapped his mustaches. Why strangle face to face? Unless there was trust, recognition. Unless she did not fear until it was too late. He circled the tree. The soil near one of the roots still bore the faint impression of a heel, crosshatched. He bent close, comparing it to the outline he had drawn earlier. American leather, he said softly. But not the colonel's boots, no. He wears English, military issue. And not Monsieur Charles, who favors a lighter soul. Whose then? Poirot straightened. We are told the impression is of a man's shoe. Perhaps, but perhaps not. The size, it is not large. And what if it were a woman's, made sturdy by foreign make? This is interesting. Returning to the house, Poirot passed through the rose garden. The dew lay heavy upon the petals, and he paused by the arched trellis. A thorn caught his sleeve, pricking through the cloth. He drew back with fastidious distaste. Ah, just so. Madame Clara, too, pricked her hand here. But she was not the only one, I think. The fiber at the bracelet. Cotton. A servant's sleeve, perhaps? Or a companion's dress. Inside, the halls were dim. Poirot moved to the morning room, where Inspector Barnes had established his base. The inspector, half dozing over his notes, started up at Poirot's entrance. You keep late hours, Barnes muttered. Poirot smiled. I keep the hours of truth, mon ami. Tell me, this cup with the lipstick. It is still here. Barnes pointed irritably to a tray. Yes, I've kept it aside. Poirot lifted it delicately. The smear of pink was faint, nearly gone. Curious, he murmured. Mademoiselle Evelyn wore lipstick, yes. But this shade, it is not hers. Hers was brighter, more careless. This, subtler, more deliberate. His eyes flickered. Another lady in the house wears lipstick. One who claims she does not. Barnes frowned. You mean Clara? Poirot shook his head. None. She wears none at all. But Mademoiselle Beatrice, she is clever. She observes, she records, she hides in plain sight. Yet once, only once, she left her mark. On a cup. Barnes muttered. You think her guilty? Poirot's mustaches twitched. I think only this. The murderer is one who tried twice. Poison first, then the scarf. The poisoner is cautious, methodical. The strangler is bold, desperate. Two natures, but in one person. And who among them has both the patience to observe and the boldness to act? Tomorrow, Inspector, I will show you. He replaced the cup with meticulous care, then gathered his notes. At the door he paused, glancing back at Barnes. You are puzzled, yes? But remember this, the murderer is not the one who appears most guilty. He is the one who hides in plain sight, whose guilt is veiled by usefulness, by discretion. Tomorrow, the veil will fall. Poirot retired at last to his chamber. Outside, the night deepened. The oak stood motionless under the moon, a silent witness to both past crime and future revelation. And as the clock struck midnight, Poirot whispered to the shadows, It is finished. Tomorrow, I pull the thread, and the whole fabric unravels. The household awoke on that gray morning with nerves rubbed raw. Breakfast was a strained affair, a parody of civility. Lady Margaret presided as she always did, her upright posture unbending, though her eyes betrayed a shadow of apprehension. Charles toyed with his bacon without appetite. Clara stirred her tea until the spoon clinked against the cup, and Colonel Redmayne thumped the table with his stick whenever silence grew too long. Dr. Forbes spoke little, his face a mask of fatigue. Beatrice, pale but composed, wrote occasionally in her notebook, though none could imagine what notes she took now. Poirot sat among them, immaculate as ever, his manner serene. He sipped his chocolate delicately and surveyed the table as though it were a chessboard nearing the end of its game. He said almost nothing, yet each glance of his eyes seemed to weigh, to measure, to judge. When the meal concluded, he rose. Mesdames et messieurs, the moment has come. I ask that you join me once more beneath the oak tree. There, in the place where tragedy struck, we shall bring the story to its end. There was a stir. Charles muttered, More theater, though his voice shook. Clara drew her shawl close about her shoulders. The colonel grumbled about damp grass, and Forbes frowned but made no protest. Lady Margaret inclined her head gravely. Jennings, as ever, stood ready to follow. Thus the company assembled once more upon the south lawn. The oak loomed above them, its branches stark against the pale sky. Chairs were set in a semicircle as before. Poirot took his place before them, his small figure curiously commanding against the vast trunk. Inspector Barnes, dour and skeptical, positioned himself with notebook in hand. Poirot began softly, his accent curling each word. "We stand where Mademoiselle Evelyn Grant met her death. At first, it seemed simple, too simple. A scarf tied, a young woman strangled, a nephew with debts, a trail of cigar ash. Voila, the murderer. But no. To Hercule Poirot, it was too neat, too arranged. And so, I looked closer. I listened. I considered. And I found the little things." He raised a finger. First, the scarf. It bore the faint scent of bitter almonds. Poison. Hydrocyanic acid. Yet she was not poisoned. She was strangled. Why both? Because the murderer attempted poison first, then, when it failed, turned to violence. Two methods in one crime, caution and desperation together. His eyes swept the semicircle. Second, the bracelet. The clasp broken, fibers caught. Cotton fibers, not from Evelyn's dress, but from another's sleeve. A struggle, yes, and close contact. Third, the bark of the oak, scraped by a button or a ring. Fourth, the shoe print, cross-hatched, small for a man. Perhaps not a man's at all. Fifth, the cup with the lipstick. Evelyn's shade was bright, careless. The cup bore a subtler tint. Another woman in the house wore it, though she claimed otherwise. There was a murmur. Clara stiffened, color draining from her face. Beatrice sat very still, her pencil resting idle. Poirot's voice sharpened. And lastly, the vial. Found upon the terrace, too conveniently. A clue planted to mislead, to point at the doctor. But a clumsy falsehood, for the true murderer would not leave such evidence so near. He stepped forward, his eyes glistening. "So, Miss Amos, who among you has both caution and boldness? Who has the patience to observe, to take notes, to study others, yet the daring to act when poison failed? Who has access to every room, every drawer, under the guise of usefulness? Who wears cotton sleeves, plain, practical? Who leaves a faint smear of lipstick upon a cup, unnoticed but for the eyes of Hercule Poirot?" The silence deepened. Beatrice's hand trembled at last. Her notebook slid from her lap to the grass. Poirot pointed, his voice ringing clear. "It was you, Mademoiselle Beatrice Latham. You killed Evelyn Grant." There was a collective gasp. Clara half rose from her chair. Charles swore under his breath. The colonel muttered, "Good God!" Dr. Forbes's expression darkened with grim recognition. Lady Margaret sat unmoving, her lips pressed tight, but her eyes betrayed both shock and something like sorrow. Beatrice's face was pale, but she did not faint. She looked at Poirot with steady eyes, though her voice shook. "You are wrong. I cared for Evelyn. I was her friend." Poirot's mustaches twitched. "No, mademoiselle. You envied her. She had beauty, wealth, the admiration of men, even the regard of Charles, though she did not return it. And she threatened your place here, did she not? You, who served Lady Margaret faithfully, feared being displaced, forgotten. In desperation, you planned. First, the poison. But Evelyn was strong. She laughed. She mocked perhaps. And then, face to face, with scarf in hand, you killed her." Beatrice rose to her feet, trembling. "No." Poirot lifted a hand. "The truth is in the details, mademoiselle. The shoe print, the size is too small for a man, too large for Evelyn. It is yours. The fiber upon the bracelet, cotton, from your sleeve. The scrape upon the bark, your button. And the cup with the lipstick, your mark, left in haste. These trifles, they condemn you." The silence was broken only by the rustle of the oak leaves above, stirred by a faint breeze. Poirot's voice softened. "Mademoiselle, confess. It will be better so." Beatrice's lips parted, her breath unsteady. She looked around at the faces turned upon her. Lady Margaret stern, Charles's furious, Clara's aghast, the colonel's grim, Forbes's contemptuous. At last, her shoulders sagged. The notebook slipped from her hand to the grass. "I did not mean it so," she whispered. "It was to frighten her only, to drive her away. She laughed at me, laughed. I struck, I pulled too hard. And then it was done." There was a collective exhalation, part horror, part relief. Lady Margaret closed her eyes. Charles muttered an oath. Clara buried her face in her hands. Poirot bowed his head gravely. It is always so. The murderer does not set out to kill. He sets out to silence, to control. And in that moment, the deed is done. Inspector Barnes stepped forward heavily, his face stern. Beatrice Latham, I must take you into custody. Beatrice did not resist. She stood very still, her face pale against the dark oak. Poirot turned away, his eyes upon the ground where Evelyn had lain. Justice, she is not kind, but she is necessary. And the oak, ancient witness, stood silent as ever, its branches swaying gently, as though it had seen such tragedies before and would see them again. The company remained beneath the oak in a stunned tableau. Beatrice, pale and rigid, was led a few paces away by Inspector Barnes and a constable, her head bowed but her steps firm. The others sat in silence, the air heavy with the weight of revelation. At length, Lady Margaret spoke, her voice low and steady. Monsieur Poirot, I would hear, fully, how you came to this. Spare us nothing. We must know. Poirot inclined his head, his eyes soft with sympathy. Madam, I shall explain. It is the habit of Hercule Poirot to set the little grey cells in order, to arrange every trifle until the picture is complete. And it is my duty now to show you how the threads were woven. He stepped closer to the oak, his small figure oddly commanding against the vast trunk. First, the matter of the poison. The scarf bore the faint scent of bitter almonds. That is no fancy, it is hydrocyanic acid. Someone attempted to poison Mademoiselle Evelyn, but it did not succeed. The vial, found upon the terrace, was a false clue. Too conveniently placed, too near the house. I said to myself, ah, this is theater. A clumsy effort to throw suspicion upon Dr. Forbes. But the poison was real, the attempt genuine. Only the placement of the vial was false. Dr. Forbes gave a grunt of indignation, but said nothing. Poirot lifted a second finger. Next, the bracelet. Its clasp was broken, and within it was caught a tiny fiber of cotton. Not from Evelyn's gown, which was of silk. No, this was from another, plain, practical fabric, worn by one who served rather than displayed. Mademoiselle Beatrice wore such sleeves. It told me that Evelyn struggled with her attacker, grasped at her wrist, and in so doing caught that fiber. Clara gave a faint gasp, but Poirot pressed on. Third, the scrape upon the bark, at the height of a button or the edge of a ring. Small, but unmistakable. And who sat always with notebook and pencil, the buttons of her bodice gleaming at just that height. Again, it was Beatrice. Poirot's eyes shone. Fourth, the shoe print. At first, Inspector Barnes thought it a man's, cross-hatched leather of American make. But I examined it. The size was small, too small for a man of Colonel Redmayne's stature, or for Monsieur Charles. Too large for Evelyn. A woman's foot, in sturdy foreign shoes. Who but Beatrice, with her practical habits, would wear such? The Colonel muttered, by Jove, but fell silent under Poirot's gaze. Fifth, the cup with the lipstick. Evelyn wore a bright, careless shade. The mark upon the cup was subtler, more deliberate. None of you, save Beatrice, wore such. She claimed not to, but the cup betrayed her. It was the one slip of a careful woman. Charles shifted uneasily, his face pale. Poirot's voice grew grave. And then, the knot of the scarf. Evelyn was strangled face to face, the knot tied as though in confrontation. Only one she knew, one she trusted enough to face directly, could have done so. Had it been a man, she would have cried out. But she did not. She laughed, until it was too late. He let the words hang. Then, softly, and so, piece by piece, the puzzle formed. The poisoner and the strangler were one and the same. The careful observer and the desperate actor, the quiet secretary, Mademoiselle Beatrice Latham. There was silence. The oak leaves stirred faintly in the breeze, the only sound. Poirot bowed his head. It was not malice, perhaps, but envy. Evelyn threatened her place, her pride, her heart. So she planned to drive her away. The poison was the first step, the scarf the second. But murder, once done, is murder still. Lady Margaret's eyes closed, her hands clasped tightly upon her lap. Beatrice. She was with me every day. Faithful, I thought. To imagine. Her voice broke. Poirot's expression softened. Madam, betrayal from those we trust cuts deepest. Yet it is always thus. Murder comes not from strangers in the night, but from those nearest to us. Inspector Barnes cleared his throat. You've explained it all, Poirot. I'll see she's taken properly. There'll be trial enough. Poirot inclined his head. Justice will take her course. It is not for us to rejoice, but to reflect. He turned back to the company, his voice gentler now. Each of you bore suspicion. You feared your secrets would condemn you. But take comfort, truth, though cruel, also frees. You are innocent. That is no small gift. Clara wept quietly into her handkerchief. Charles put an arm awkwardly around her, more humbled than defiant. The colonel sat stiffly, his mustache drooping, his eyes avoiding the others. Dr. Forbes muttered of wasted reputations, but even his bitterness could not pierce the solemnity of the moment. Poirot looked up into the branches of the oak, its scars now part of its endless history. Yes, he said softly, it has seen much, this tree. But no more shall it guard the secret of Evelyn Grant's death. For truth, at last, has been spoken. And in the silence that followed, the ancient oak seemed almost to bow its branches in assent. The day after the revelation, Greystone Manor seemed a different place. Though the same sun lit its stone facade, though the same ivy clung to its walls, an air of desolation had crept in, as though the very house mourned what had been uncovered beneath its roof. Beatrice Latham was taken away before dawn. She did not struggle, she did not weep. Jennings, who had always treated her with a quiet respect, watched her go with an expression of deep sorrow, though he said nothing. The cart that bore her down the drive disappeared into the morning mist, leaving only silence in its wake. Within the manor, the household tried to resume its pattern, but the pattern was broken. Lady Margaret presided at breakfast with her customary composure, yet her face was drawn, and the lines at the corners of her mouth seemed newly etched. Her goddaughter was gone, murdered. Her companion of years was revealed as the murderer. It was too much for even her iron control. Twice her hand trembled as she poured the tea, and twice she steadied it before anyone could remark. Charles Harrington appeared subdued, the swagger drained from him. His debts still hung over him, but the suspicion of murder no longer did. Clara, pale but calmer, sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a truce. She had seen his folly, but she had also seen his innocence. In grief and relief alike, there was room for some new understanding. Colonel Redmayne remained irritable, though less with others than with himself. He had blustered, accused, defended, all in vain. His pride was wounded, his certainty unsettled. He sat long in the library with his Times unopened, staring into the cold grate as though seeking in its ashes the certainties of old campaigns that no longer served him here. Dr. Forbes walked the grounds restlessly. The planted vial had cast suspicion on him, and though Poirot had cleared his name, the sting remained. The villagers would whisper, he knew. In every small town, once a rumor begins, it clings. He muttered bitterly about it to Poirot, who only inclined his head and said, "It is so, mon cher docteur." But better whispers than chains. Jennings moved about his duties with his usual precision, but his eyes were heavier than before. To see Miss Latham, who had kept accounts and correspondence with such diligence, revealed as a murderer, it had shaken him more than he let slip. He polished the silver with exactness, as though order in small things might mend disorder in greater. That evening, when the lamps were lit in the great hall, Lady Margaret invited Poirot to sit with her by the fire. For a long time she said nothing, only gazed into the flames. At last she spoke. "You have given me truth, Monsieur Poirot. It is bitter. I thought Beatrice faithful. She was with me always, my right hand. To think she harbored envy so deep, hatred so cold, it chills me more than the grave." Poirot's eyes softened. "Madam, betrayal is always from those near. Strangers do not murder for envy of the heart. It is those close to us, those who feel too much, who strike. You could not have known." She shook her head slowly. "Perhaps I should have known. Perhaps I saw and chose not to see. She resented Evelyn. I remember it now. Her glances, her silences. We excuse so much in those we trust." Poirot bowed. "We all do, madam. It is human." For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Lady Margaret straightened. "The house must go on. It has stood for centuries. It will not fall now. Jennings will assist me. Clara, perhaps she will take some place by my side, if she chooses. Charles must mend his ways. We cannot undo what is done, but we can endure it." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "That is wisdom, madam." Later, when he retired to his chamber, Poirot stood by the window and looked once more at the oak. Its vast trunk gleamed silver in the moonlight. It had borne witness, as it had for centuries, and now it bore scars both in bark and in memory. Poirot, ever the philosopher, murmured, "The oak endures. So must we. But to endure with truth, that is the greater strength." And within the silent manor, the words seemed to echo, as though the house itself acknowledged them. The days that followed were marked by a slow, somber rhythm. The shock of revelation gave way to the dull ache of aftermath. The rooms of Greystone were quieter than before, as if the house itself were subdued, its proud walls bowed beneath the weight of betrayal. Poirot lingered only long enough to see that the household regained some measure of composure. He walked the gardens with Clara Harrington, who confessed her relief that suspicion no longer fell upon her husband, though her voice carried the weariness of disillusionment. He exchanged a few words with Charles, who, humbled by events, promised to attend to his affairs with more seriousness. Poirot listened politely, though he doubted the promise would hold. He saw the colonel once, dozing in the library, his stick fallen across his knees and the Times unopened beside him. Pride wounded, yet not broken, the old soldier remained what he had always been, a man clinging to the certainties of yesterday. Lady Margaret, though shaken, resumed her duties with quiet dignity. She wrote letters of condolence, oversaw the servants, and moved through her house as if to remind it that order still reigned. Yet Poirot saw, in the stillness of her eyes, that a deep wound had been made, one not soon to heal. On his last evening at Greystone, Poirot took supper with Lady Margaret in the great hall. The fire crackled, casting tall shadows upon the portraits of Whitcomb's long dead. She poured him wine with her own hand. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you have brought us truth. I cannot thank you, for what you revealed has broken much within these walls. But I can say this, you have preserved us from falsehood. That is something." Poirot bowed his head. "Madam, truth is often bitter, but to live without it is poison also. Better to drink the bitter draught and be free." She regarded him steadily. "You speak like a philosopher, not a detective." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps the difference is less than we think." The following morning, Poirot prepared to leave. Jennings carried his small valise to the waiting motor car. The household assembled briefly in the hall to see him off. Clara thanked him with quiet sincerity. Charles managed a stiff handshake. The colonel muttered something about foreign methods, but there was no heat in his voice. Dr. Forbes inclined his head gravely. Lady Margaret alone accompanied Poirot to the door. He paused upon the threshold, immaculate as ever, mustaches gleaming in the morning light. He turned to her. "Madam, you will endure. Your house, your name, they are strong. And in time, the wound will close. But remember this, trust, once broken, leaves a scar like the bark of the oak. It does not vanish, but it need not destroy." She nodded, her face composed. "You are right, Monsieur Poirot. As always." Poirot stepped into the motor car. As it drove slowly down the long gravel drive, he looked back once. The manor stood solemn and proud, ivy-clad, unchanged and yet forever altered. Beyond it, the oak rose vast against the pale sky, ancient, silent, and enduring. Poirot murmured to himself as the car turned out upon the lane, "There is no tree without its shadow, no soul without its secrets. The little gray cells, they reveal the truth, but it is the heart that must endure it." And with that, Hercule Poirot departed from Greystone, leaving behind a house forever marked by the crime beneath the old oak tree.